The previous post discussed the importance of the patient narrative as the foundation of the medical process. We move on now to the step of documenting the patient's narrative. We must first acknowledge that the patient's narrative, despite its importance, is not actually recorded. And so just to repeat this, we do not write down the patient's narrative in the chart. The patient history section of the medical record is a narrative written by the physician. And in this way, the narrative is what the physician thinks they heard the patient tell them. And we all know that what someone thinks they hear and what a person says are two very different things. To easily just prove this point, ask the person helping you with tech support to repeat back to you what they wrote down as the problem you're having with your device. In this way, it's important to realize that the patient history section of the physician note is potentially an error-riddled document produced by the listener of the story and is not a credible first-hand artifact. Because the written narrative is not written by its primary subject, the patient, errors enter into the physician note during the steps of narrative translation and during the step of truncation. So let's first talk about translation. Translation occurs when the physician converts expressions in the patient's narrative into specific medical terms. A patient may describe their chest pain, and the physician typically does not write word for word what the patient has been saying, but might shorten this description to a few words, such as representing a medical term like angina, or they might use the term pleuritic chest pain. This step introduces considerable diagnostic error. First, different physicians may use different medical terms to describe a series of patient symptoms. Although many terms have formal definitions, in practice, the use of words is looser, and we don't know if a physician might be using a word with a formal diagnostic definition or just using it in an informal, colloquial way. Second, medical terminology is extremely loaded. To say that a patient's chest pain is angina begins to frame the patient narrative as a cardiac problem. To say their pain is pleuritic chest pain begins to frame their problem as a respiratory problem. This framing bias starts the moment that the physician begins to translate the narrative from the patient into medical terminology. And then this bias then propagates into whoever reads the note that was written using these words. The second problem that we have in the writing down of the patient narrative is this truncation step. And this occurs when the patient's narrative is shortened to what the physician perceives as the key points. In order to know what the key points are in theory, one needs to know what the diagnosis is. And although a physician might have a diagnostic hunch and be building a real-time differential diagnosis of what the final condition might be, ultimately, the final diagnosis is unlikely to be arrived at when the initial note is written. In this way, the truncation step, which allegedly retains the key aspects of the patient narrative and disregards those which are not important, is prone to the error of over-including details that might be red herrings and leaving out details that were not perceived at the start to be important. What can we do about this? A few thoughts. The translation step can be avoided by recording in the note the patient's words as closely as possible when describing their symptoms. And I've seen a lot of expert clinicians use direct quotes throughout their note as a way to try to capture, to the best recollection of their memory, what a patient said. This is a good practice. The truncation step is more difficult to manage. In theory, one could audio record the entire patient encounter and store it in the chart, or transcribe the entire patient encounter word for word. This would retain the original patient narrative completely. However, it also creates an artifact that's unlikely to be ever reviewed given its length. And I have a post pending on the utility of storing the entire patient encounter as a video, but it's a separate topic. The reality is that it's reasonable to believe that truncation is a required step in the standard medical documentation process. Now, Ideally, truncation would follow a semi-standardized approach, as Larry Weed would have proposed, and this would mitigate against the risk of information being disregarded early on in history that might turn out to be important later on. I recognize that there's a variety of startups and organizations that are working on transcribing the physician-patient clinical conversation into a structured note, but that's a topic for another day. So let's summarize. The patient narrative is never written down in clinical medicine. Instead, physicians translate what they think the patient said into medical jargon. This introduces bias at the level of cognitive reasoning, as well as diagnostic momentum in the word choice used. Furthermore, important details might be left out during narrative truncation, and unimportant details might be potentially overemphasized. This explains why expert physicians typically pay quite little attention to previous documentation of a patient's history in the clinical notes, and prefer to have the patient retell their story firsthand in undiagnosed and difficult cases. I've even seen some physicians go as far as to refuse to read previous notes about a patient's history before first speaking with the patient, as they are so worried that the other physician's documentation of the patient's story will unduly influence them and their thought process. The next post will discuss the errors that are derived when one tries to fit a patient's narrative into a standard narrative structure. Thanks for joining.